will say briefly, she is the author of this beautiful book of poetry that I teach all the time because its premise and its poetry are so beautiful. And we're going to come back to this in a second, but I'll let you talk now.
Okay, so I'm a poet, and I'm the author of and I'm the author of Islanders, which is a book of poems on the history of Chinese immigration at the Angel Island Immigration Station. And do you guys know Angel Island? It's
Oh.
Oh. It's in the San Francisco Bay, and they say it's the Ellis Island of the West, but it was designed for Chinese exclusion during the Chinese exclusion era. So Chinese were detained there as they tried to come into the United States to prove that they were eligible to come into the U.S. And many of them were detained for weeks, at least 2 weeks usually, months, and in some cases a couple of years. And they wrote poems on the walls. And I don't know if you guys can see this image here. It's a picture I took at Angel Island, and it's part of a poem that they wrote. All the poems on record were found in a men's barracks. The women's barracks burned down in a fire. And in this book, I imagine what the women might have said. And I don't know how we knew each other. We'll just run in the same circles, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
I read her books. She read my books.
We like each other.
Yeah. I think so.
So we are going to start today off with a reading just a little bit so you can get a sense of our voice and then dive into some questions. I'm going to dive in by reading one of my favorite characters. I'm not going to set it up too much, but her name is Gretchen, and she is not a silent, stoic John Wayne male. She is a house cleaner. She loves to live a calm and simple life. She likes to smoke some pot. She likes to take care of nature, and she is not maternal. She doesn't want kids, and all of these things put her into a crunch later in the book. But one thing she does is she is the knight in shining armor, as when she saves 2 kids from a bear. And if any of you aren't Coloradoans, I just like you to close your eyes and imagine that this scene actually could take place right around now as the bears are getting ready for hibernation and coming into people's towns. So I just want to read a little bit of Gretchen out with 2 young kids. And that's when we heard it. A huff, 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 and another huff. And the first thing that hit me was the smell. A very bad smell, really. And I said, "Oh, kids," at the same time that the bear appeared out of the raspberry bushes and regarded us. "Oh, kids," I said again. I said very calmly, "Don't worry, kids. It will go away." And then I addressed the bear. "Bear, go away, bear." But it did not go away. It was moving from the raspberry bushes towards the apple tree as if it had not seen us, although surely it had, because we were only 30 feet away. It seemed very calm. It was a dark brown, darker in the head. Its ears were round, and its nose curved upward just a bit. It took 4 steps and then sat back on its butt, and I realized it was a she because of the nubs of her nipples ran down her belly. Zoe let out a small animal noise, and Michael was frozen, but I could tell he was about to scream or run. So I said very fast, "Kids, don't move, don't move. Stay right next to me. That's right, move right in behind me." I kept my eyes on the bear, who paused and seemed to be listening to me too. I shuffled them behind me. "Bear," I said, "we are not going to hurt you, and you can have the apples, but if you hurt us, I will hurt you back." The kids were starting to cry, so I said, "Kids, I want you to know one thing. The bear will have to fight me before she gets to you, and let me tell you, I can put up a great fight." While I was talking, the bear stared at me for a long time and then got bored and started walking in a direction a little to the right. All she wanted was that apple tree. I started backing up, kids behind me looking around for sticks, but there weren't any. But there were a few bruised and wormy apples scattered out where we were, so I bent over slowly, picked up 3 at my feet. She sat down suddenly and huffed. She seemed uncertain as to what to do with herself. Her need to get to those apples was very strong, but so was my desire to protect these kids. And I won't tell you what happens. You'll have to read. Thank you.
I'm going to read one of the early poems in the book. It's called The Waves. And so in this book, what I did a lot was I have the historical records. I mean, well, people have done research into some of these women's stories. And I take situations or sometimes actual stories and invent a voice behind it. In this story, this is 1924, that's when Congress implemented the Immigration Act, which denied admission to all aliens ineligible to citizenship. One of the things about the Chinese Exclusion Act was that Chinese were not allowed to become US citizens. So when you deny that, one of the categories of people were women who were coming to the US to join their husbands already in the US. And when they left China, they thought they would be allowed, and that was what the law was. It's about a 7-week journey. And sometime, I think it's it's a few weeks. And when they were at sea, the law changed. So when they arrived at Angel Island, they found they could not enter. As you know, we saw that January of last year. His father died suddenly, leaving a sick wife and 4 young girls. He decided to go to America, stake a claim on Golden Mountain, and come back for me. He wrote to me of Angel Island, where officers scrutinized his papers and doctors made him stand naked as they inspected his eyes. He built a business selling groceries, sent money home, and came back to marry me. I threw upon the sea. He calmed me, made love to me. The first time I cried silently. I had not been with another man, but I knew he had a woman. What could I do? There was no land in sight. San Francisco, the green hills of the late spring on the verge of a golden splendor. The city rose from the sea, veiled in a hazy blue. They let him land from the ship, but I had to board a ferry. They didn't even let us say goodbye. There's nothing we can do. Foreign wife of a Chinese merchant, your case is automatically denied. At night I watched the sea. I want its embrace, cold, dangerous, overwhelming. In these waves, I will finally be home.
Very nice.
That when I read that, because this book came out in 2016, which means it was read as current affairs rather than history. And my book tour went into early 2017, and reading that poem in early 2017 was quite a trip.
Thank you. Do you want to dive into the questions we had? Do you want to ask them, or?
We can start. You know, one of the things I've realized I know my own book, and when I read your book, is that both of us are writing against stereotypes. You know, for you have the stereotypes of the American West, the stoic John Wayne character types. And for me, there are all kinds of stereotypes about immigrants in general. As you know, they are demonized as bad hombres on one hand, and then there's also for me, because I'm writing about the Chinese, Chinese were demonized back then in language very similarly used to demonize, Mexicans and Muslims now. But on the other hand, Chinese now are considered the model minority who keep quiet and don't speak up, and certainly don't write, resistance poems on the walls. So one of the questions that we thought we could talk about is, why is it so important to write our characters fully instead of relying on cliches? And maybe you can start.
I'll start. Thank you for that good question. I think we're both pushing hard to write books, poetry and fiction that make people uncomfortable slightly, and as good art should. And art can show us where we need to head or what is yet to come, or, as somebody said at the opening ball ceremony yesterday, a gazing ball of a future. And to do that, I think you have to really look at the past and see what cliches have been presented to us. And there's obvious ones like John Wayne, but there's less obvious ones. And really give voice to the voiceless and give voice to people who have not yet been heard. One of those, in my mind, is the rural, poor, blue-collar West, which is the world I grew up in. But the kind of idea that they're not philosophers and thinkers, and somebody fixing fence on a ranch might not be thinking very grand questions about what it is. And then there's a lot of stereotypes surrounding femininity and a woman's role, I think, still very, very prevalent, although quietly prevalent in the West, and sexuality, issues of sexuality and comfort with a lively and healthy sexuality. And so I took some risks with this book and tried to combine a whole bunch of voices that would each get to speak and break down one or two particular stereotypes with each chapter. And we're going to address this later, but both of our books kind of give a voice, like a multiplicity of voices. Each chapter in my book is narrated by someone else in the town. And so it's a little bit like a Winesburg, Ohio situation, in which the Winesburg, Ohio is the actual main character, but everyone gets to say their piece about what the town looks like. So I think I took a chance in this book in that I didn't want to write a normal narrative. I know that normal narratives are easier, and you can latch onto a character and hear their voice throughout, and it arcs in a normal plot line. But I really wanted to tackle something else, which was tearing down stereotypes and letting people speak up for their sexual lives, whatever that may be, and whatever stage and whatever situation. And so those together, I hope, really give this community a chance to speak up for itself in a way that breaks down stereotypes and therefore lets us see the rural West, the mountain West, with renewed clarity and a clearer sense of who everyone is and what their messy, wonderful humanity is. To me, it's not just art; it's political imperative, really, to let people speak up and hear the voices that we don't often hear, say, coming out of New York or profiled in the New York Times. There's a whole swath of America that I feels that they are voiceless. So that's what I was trying to do, in part, with this book.
What is the book?
The book is The Blue Hour. It's my most recent novel.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's really good. And if you want to read about sex, you can read it.
But not erotica, not porn, not Hallmark, not. I hope it's not a romance novel. Nothing against. What I hope is this is literary sexuality. So can you answer that same question about breaking down stereotypes and the political imperative of doing so?
So in the case of my book, it's, even more, I wouldn't say more imperative, but so for me, when I was, when the book first came out and I was doing like book tours and promotions and interviews and stuff, and there was an interviewer who asked me, and this is how this point came out in the first place, is, some writers who approach this topic might treat these women as angels, but she pointed out that I don't, and they're flawed, messy characters, and later on they just betray each other and they ignore each other's pain and things that people do when they're traumatized on one hand, and also it's also human. For me, when I was writing the book, I was trying to make the characters as human and as real as possible instead of following any kind of stereotypes. On the other hand, I realized after this book came out, and as I said, it came out in 2016, which was a bad political climate for immigration. And I realized in giving these people the full humanity, I am, portraying immigrants as human. They may do good things, they may do bad things, they suffer, they have joy, and in a climate that says that, we're going to allow in, the good immigrants, and we're going to, deport the bad hombres. I want to question, what does it mean to be a bad hombre? How do we define that category? For a lot of these women, because of the laws back then, they could only come as the wife or daughter of men. Basically, there were two laws. One is that you cannot be, potentially a public charge, and Chinese women who are prostitutes were not allowed to the country. How you determine who's a prostitute, that's another question. It's humiliating. And so for many of these women, like women who are not accompanied by men, were disallowed on the grounds that because of racism and sexism, they would be unlikely to find a job and would either become a public charge or a prostitute. So in this environment, a lot of them came as, mostly wives, not so much daughters. And then there's the question of proving the legitimacy of the marriage. And the thing is, how do you prove these things? How do you say that someone is, coming in, for immigration purposes versus, because she's coming to join the husband that she loves? And these are questions that, to some extent, are questions that, we are dealing with now. Who do we admit? Who do we not admit? And so what I realized is that for me, writing these people, as there is one poem of a woman who is basically coming in for an arranged marriage, and she has all the paperwork lined up, but she's still dreaming of the lover that she left back home. So is this from the immigration perspective, it's like the paperwork lined up, but is she someone we're going to take or not? Why? And yeah, that's my long-winded answer.
I think we both write from multiple points of view. Should we talk about that as well? Breaking down stereotypes, but also hoping to give voice to a whole bunch of people. That's one thing our books have in common, not just one or two. I did that again because I felt like this was an important time to talk about community instead of individuals. And I wrote this pre-election, but I felt like we were coming to a point in humanity. I was more hopeful then that we were evolving and that things were, at any point in time, it's nice to let go of the ego and see yourself as part of a living organism. And almost the way that you can think of fungi on trees or bacteria in the soil. We're also very connected. And my other books were very much stories of individuals and their particular trauma. One details the travels of a man with early set Alzheimer's tracking down the killer of his daughter. And another book is about a young mother holding a baby as her sister drives off, and she's stuck in rural Colorado to raise this child and doesn't know how. So they're stories of individual lives, but I wanted to tackle the story of community where really no one is more important than the other. And there's this whole mix of people in the hopes that, and this book came out the same year, and so it was important to me that there be books about community, about coming together, especially under trauma, I will say, because in the first chapter of this book, there's a traumatic event. The town veterinarian dies, and I'm not giving anything away by that, so I hope you'll read the book anyway. But the town veterinarian dies in a violent death, and it's a tragedy. It's horrible. But what that does is force everyone to live a little stronger, be a little truer to one another, check in with their relationships a little better, check in with their hearts a little better, kind of up their game as a human being. But most importantly, up their game as a human being in a community that depends upon each other, because it's set in a small rural mountain town, fictitious one, but we can all imagine towns. And everyone has got to work a little harder, even to the point of exhaustion, which I think many of us feel right now, to keep things going on a good and better path and a healing path. And so I thought the release of my book and its sense of community was fortuitous or interesting in that regard too. But I'm so glad I wrote the multiple points of view at this particular moment in time.
So my book, well, when I said it's about the women, that's the first 10 poems. The next 10 poems is it's from the point of view of the men who are waiting for them in San Francisco. And then the third section is actually from the point of view of the staff at Angel Island. And the last section actually goes back in history to let me remember which year, 1877 San Francisco Chinatown riot. It was one of the riots, anti-Chinese riots in the late 1800s that led up to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And what I consciously did in this book is that every single poem is from a different voice. I do not repeat any voices. I do repeat stories. Like, for example, I have a story in the women's section. This is based on history, by the way. It's in the records. There was a woman who attempted suicide. A matron, she tried to hang herself, but one of the staff actually found her in time and cut the rope. What happened was she was on Angel Island with her infant son. Her son died of a fever. The immigration officers allowed her husband to come pick up the boy's remains and to bring him to San Francisco, and her husband requested that she be allowed to attend the boy's funeral. And the immigration officers said, no, there's no unusual hardships found. So I tell the story from the point of view of a woman who witnesses this, not from the woman herself, the woman who witnesses this. Then I have another poem from the woman's husband's point of view, and then I have yet another poem from the point of view of the immigration officer who said no. And after this book came out, this is probably a little off topic, but after this book came out, one of the, I think he's the community development director of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, he actually contacted me, and he said that he loved the book, and that woman is actually the great-grandmother of one of his friends.
Wow.
She eventually landed. She went on to have 9 more kids.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
But anyway, so as I said, every single poem is a different voice, but some stories are repeated. And in doing so, I felt that I could look at this topic from different points of view. Because I don't want to say like victims, but it's very easy to write from the victims. I'm not saying it's very easy, but it's morally pretty straightforward to write from the victim's point of view. You're advocating for the victims. Mm. Good. But what happens when you start writing from the oppressor's point of view? What, for them, so, I mean, if you think about, the Chinese woman, it's easy to sympathize with them. But when you say, the officers on Angel Island, and how about there were Chinese in America who were hired as interpreters at Angel Island. What kind of internal conflicts do they go through? And so for me to present all these points of view, but I think especially from the point of view of the oppressor, is to try and understand where this political dynamics of anti-immigration sentiment comes about. How do people abuse their power? What kind of systems do we create that encourages this abuse of power? What kind of incentives do we give people, to enforce these exclusions? And I have a poem about a clerk on Angel Island. He's there for the paycheck. He's there to transcribe the interviews, and he doesn't. He kind of sees that. Maybe these people are suffering, but really, I just want to go home at 5 o'clock. And when you create these, something like an exclusion law, you have all these people who are involved in upholding it in different ways, whether they're like, I hate immigrants, I'm going to work at Angel Island, or like, I need a job.
One interesting thing that strikes me that I want to ask her about, and then we have one other question to ask each other, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. But speaking of that, we're both writing characters who are not us. And people approach me all the time, and they're like, which character's more like you, or which character's based on you? And I sometimes want to say, man, if I were like every one of my characters, I wouldn't get anything done in life, because some of them are very messed up, and some of them are very workaholic, and some of them, but I am not my characters. It's really the joy of a fiction writer to create something that is not me, in fact, very far away from my experience. In fact, my editor of this book at Counterpoint Press, Stan Schmatenka, he's a wonderful guy, and he did say in the first draft, he said, I really love these chapters, but a few of them sound too much like self-introspective people trying to be aware, which reminds me a little of you, Laura, so could you try to write a few people who have no awareness of like, what's going on? So I did, and that was fun. But, I'm always pushing to I don't want to write about me. I want to write about people who are not me. I don't want to write what I know. I want to write what I want to know. I want to write other people's psychology and fears and problems and issues and behavior patterns that are unfamiliar to me. I do a lot of research and talking and listening, but they're not me, which is a relief mostly. But but I wondered, you have the same, some poetry is very autobiographical, but you are really writing characters of your imagination, I think.
Yes, and if all I write about myself, no one will want to read my books.
Although you're working on a bit of a memoir about your life in the West.
It's an essay collection.
Yeah,
it's not that much about me, but
okay, it's very interesting, and that's what's in progress for her.
Yeah, but I don't know about you, but for me, I think when I write a character, even a character who's unlikable, even, the immigration officer at Angel Island who, denies everything and everything, I feel that I have to put a little part of myself in there. So it's not me, and it's not 100% me, but I feel that if I write a character, if I go into a character thinking, I'm going to write a person who is not me, it turns out actually a pretty flat character. I mean, that's at least in my experience. Well, as I say, like, okay, if I am put in this situation, this horrible situation, how might I respond?
Yeah, I think that's true for some of the psychology I can jive with, but I don't make meth, and I don't smoke as much. I don't smoke pot like Gretchen does, and
yeah.
I've visited a bear in a den, but I haven't thrown apples at a bear, and so some of the actions are purely made up. But I do feel a little sympathy with some of each of their psychological situations.
Maybe another way to put it is to be sympathetic to the psychological situations, rather than like, I'm writing a bad person, he's going to be bad, and it's I don't know. To me, it doesn't work. Yeah. I mean, I have a friend who wrote a serial killer who crucifies kittens, but
that'd be tough. That'd be tough.
Yeah.
Well, we had one other question for each other, and then would like to open it up. But I think, or do you want to ask it?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think that our last question is about writing about the erotic and the sexual. As I said, her book is about sex and sex. I'm exaggerating, and I actually joke. When my book came out, I joked that it's really about sex, drugs, and violence. If you go into it, there is sex, drugs, and violence. So I guess why is it so important? And okay, when I say that, she writes a lot about sexuality, it's a lot about the dark parts, the difficult decisions. Some people's characters have thoughts that would be considered unacceptable or unlikable, but obviously, as what she said, a lot of it's, self-reflective and interior in the book. So why is it important to portray that on the page?
Thank you for that question. I think we're both interested in that topic. I have studied contemporary American literature for my whole life, and it's the subject of all my degrees. And if there's one thing I find truly disappointing in American literature, it's our ability to talk about the sexual being in a way that's really raw and open and real. There are exceptions, very good writers. Anne Waldman, reading last night, was one of them. But is one of them. There are exceptions to this rule, but a lot of the time in good American literature, there's two people and they're together, and then there's a chapter break, and then they wake up in bed the next morning. And you know that the problem with avoiding or skipping sex in good literature is that that's when we're most vulnerable. That's when things get revealed, whether things happened and went well or didn't happen, or you wish they happened, or they happened and that was horrible. Whatever happened, something got revealed there, and I feel like Americans had some very brave years in which sexuality came up, and then we got very safe. And there's Jane Smiley and some others in interviews have talked about the same phenomena, that American literature got suddenly very prim and proper, only to its detriment, because we're not talking about something, the elephant in the room, and it's not in everybody's life, and it doesn't have to be in every novel, but to skip it or avoid it in some novels just seems like cowardice on my part. So about 10 years ago, I started underlining every sex scene I came across in a work of contemporary American or world writing, really. So I just joke that my teenagers grew up in a house where all they had to do was like grab a book and flip it open, and they could immediately access the sex scene without having to read anything else. But or they might think I was a deviant of some sort, but no, I was just really interested in who was writing good sex scenes, like ones that were powerful and moving and served a purpose and characterized the character, deepened the characters. And then I underlined ones where it got skipped or was awkward or avoided. There is a Worst Sex Scene in Fiction award given out every year by a British newspaper. John Updike has won it more times than anyone. And he is so gracious about it. The thing about John Updike is he's brave enough to try, but he's got some hilariously bad sex scenes. And he's cool with them. They're all printed on the website. Just Google worst sex scenes. And the whole point of giving the award is to encourage good sex scenes, but beware of the bad ones, because when they're bad, they're really bad. And I think that's why authors shy away from writing them, is because if people are like, oh boy, no more heaving breasts, please, then you've made it you've not done your job as a literary writer. You've not brought beauty and freshness to language and the human condition. And so after studying for 10 years a self-directed dissertation in a way about sex scenes in America, I wrote this book with the idea that I would try to take one look into everybody's sex life. Sometimes it's just a quick glance, sometimes it's a full-on view, and just what are they really feeling? And one thing I want to say about this is I got so much positive feedback. I had one of these chapters published as a short story in The Sun magazine, and it was about violent fantasy, women having violent fantasies but not wanting violence in their real life, and what was that about? It's a very touchy and tender subject that not that many people want to talk about. I can't tell you how much fan mail I got, or just mail encouraging me to write about that more, because suddenly women, they were all from women who felt less lonely. And that's a role of literature, is to make us all feel less lonely on this planet. And they were glad that my main character had wondered some very vulnerable things about, was she healthy? Was she sexually healthy? What was going on in her mind? Where did these fantasies come from? Why did she have these fantasies as a progressive feminist woman? All questions that are hard to answer. And I think it was the fan mail that kind of spurred me to keep on writing, so I just want to thank any of you who have ever written an author, because those letters really matter. But I was really honored to go into territory that was what I consider a bit tough and new, and I also got some hate mail from people who thought I took things too far, and that's okay. I'll take that. How about you? Are we okay on time?
Okay. So for me, one of my earliest writing teachers is Lydia Yoke, and I don't know if how many of you are familiar with her work. A lot of her early work is extremely sexual and violent, but one of the most important things that she taught me was that sex is part of our life. Oh, maybe not so much sex, the erotic is part of our lives. And I remember one of the earliest assignments that I had to do for her was to write as an erotic scene that is not about sex. And I remember in that class there were people who came up with really bizarre shit, but but I think it's a good exercise to think about eros and sexuality as a kind of connection between people, but also in the world. And so that's where my training came from. In the case of my book, well, as I said earlier, I tried to write whole, as much as I can, like full characters. But as I also said, a lot of these were women who were coming to join their husbands who they haven't seen for years. Obviously, they're thinking about sex. And sometimes in better ways, sometimes in probably, I wouldn't say healthy, but less acceptable ways. But I also think that, this is, a book about trauma that's politically imposed as well as from within. One of the questions I had in my notes when I was writing the book is, what are the intimate consequences of political decisions? How do decisions made by people we don't know, we don't see, and back then they're not on TV all the time, how do they impact our lives? And obviously, in the case of, in these stories I'm writing, there are husbands and wives being separated, and that, that affects their intimate lives. So that was one of the things that I wanted to explore in this book, and I'll just read a short poem. So this is from the section from The Men, and it's called At the Brothel. I wait here for you to arrive, my wife. I'm counting the days before they let you come to shore. I can already hear the voices of her children, see their tiny feet playing in the sand. You would never forgive me if you knew. But what can I say? At night I lie awake, alone, wanting the comfort of home. So, yeah.
I think we're opening it up for questions. Please wait for...
Sure. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Is it Teow?
It's Teow. It rhymes with meow.
Okay. My question is why you chose to write these amazing stories in poetic form.
So, wow, this is a long, good story. So, this was my first ever attempt to write poetry. Like, I thought I was a prose writer before this. The main reason why I tried to write it in poetic form is because there were poems in Angel Island. Poems. And so I actually visited Angel Island back in 2010. That was the first time I went. And you can actually still see the poems on the walls. And they filled the whole wall. Obviously, a lot of them is, pretty faded. There are a few that are well preserved, especially there's one that's behind a mirror. And you tell it's behind a mirror because there's a sink below it. And that was when I started thinking, what might the women have said? And then I'm like, uh-oh, I have to write poetry. I don't know how to do this. I'll figure this out somehow. And I guess I did, and I continue writing poetry.
Are those original poems published anywhere? Like, have they been translated?
Yes, there's actually been 2 translations. One of them is called Island, and it was 3 Chinese American activists back in the 1980s, and all of them are descendants of Angel Island detainees. They actually compiled, they found all of the poems that they could. Well, actually, there are 3 sources of poems. This is another good story. There were in the 1930s. There were 2 detainees who instead of writing their own poems, they spent their time copying down poems, snuck them to San Francisco when they landed. Oh. That was part of the record. In the 1970s, so Angel Island closed in 1940. It was, there was a fire that destroyed the administration building and the women's barracks. And no one was hurt. Everyone was moved to the San Francisco County Jail. And it was abandoned. It was used during World War II, and then it was abandoned. In the 1970s, the California state parks, they wanted to demolish all the buildings and turn it into, you know, kind of campsites and recreational stuff. And there was a park ranger he's actually of Jewish descent. And he was asked to inspect the buildings and to see, you know, whatever it was he was asked to do. And he stepped into the building, he turned on his flashlight, and he saw all these poems on the walls. And he didn't understand Chinese at all, but he knew that they had significance. And he brought it to the attention of the Asian American community in San Francisco, and particularly one of his professors at San Francisco State, who brought a photographer to document all of that. That led to a movement to preserve Angel Island, but that also led to the recording of more poems. So the book Island, it's a collection of the poems, translations, as well as oral history with detainees. There's actually a new translation of the Angel Island poems that came out this spring by poet Jeffrey Leong out in San Francisco, and he actually did his own retranslations. So the first book I told you about, it was the editors and the translator, well, the translator basically, she made the decision to translate for content, not for poetic form. Yeah. And and her decision is based on the fact that she's trying to preserve this as a historical document. And I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate argument. But the translations, I mean, they're interesting, but you can tell that it did not pay attention to the poetry. And Jeffrey's new translations translated them as poetry, and it paid attention to the artistry as well as much as the content. So yes, the long story short is that yes, these poems have been recorded, have been translated. The books are out in the world. You can find them wherever you find your books.
It's working. You said that the poems you said that the women's barracks burned.
Yes. Is
there any indication that women had written poetry? Do we have any sense of that? And
that's the good question. So for a long time, people thought that women did not write poems because back then, amongst the Chinese, I mean, most of the Chinese who came to America, they were poor. They were coming here to, work in the mines and the railroads and make money and go home. So the poor families tended to educate their sons, but not their daughters. But oral history interviews with female detainees said they saw poems. It's unlikely that there were as many as the men's, but they existed. And they were also in San Francisco, Chinatown in the early 1900s. They also had this thing like poetry clubs where people could come together to write poetry. And from my understanding is that there were women who attended those as well and wrote poems for those. There is actually a really great book of translations of those poems. It's called Songs of Gold Mountain, and it's edited and translated by Marlon Home. And some of those poems are about so those were not written at Angel Island. It's written in San Francisco, but they were about the Angel Island experience. And then there's also other poems about like marriage and sex and love and, the whole spectrum of life.
Hi, thanks a lot for reading from the books. That was very wonderful. I have a question for both of you, actually. That have you considered the impact of class in your characters? For example, if Laura's character would have been an extremely rich woman, but living a simple life, would she be subjected to racism or antagonism the way your character has has experienced, or in your case, Teow, if a rich Chinese woman is coming from China to join her husband, would that make an impact? The reason I'm asking this question is that it feels that anti-immigration sentiments in today's America are limited to poor people. The country is run by rich, and anybody who is not rich is on welfare, and that's their definition. Mm-hmm. So if you have a rich Muslim guy, or for example, Jacksonville Jaguars owner, Shahryar Khan, he's Muslim, he doesn't get any flack. Mm-hmm. Rich Jews, rich Chinese people, rich Indian people, rich black people, they don't get subject to racism. Why is that racism and anti-immigration sentiment is the domain of poor people? Thank you.
Thanks for that wonderful question. I do think that race, or that class is the one undiscussed, the major undiscussed way of experience privilege, or various modes of stereotyping, or so on. And I really tried to take that on, and I tried to take that in each of my books, because I come from a very poor, blue-collar, rural atmosphere that I admire and respect and love, and feel has been left out of a lot of literature. But I do think the one thing that's not being discussed, we have a lot of great conversations going on in this country, but money. Money is not one of them, and what that means for individual lives. And certainly, I tried to cover a lot of territory in this book, folks making meth in a trailer house, folks living wonderful, beautiful lives in trailer houses, some teachers, but mostly I write about the world of the non-wealthy, because it's the world I know, but also it's the world I'm interested in unpacking a little bit. There's so many books, it strikes me, and I can get a little snooty about this, but it seems to me there's so many books about people who have quite a bit of privilege, traveling and having great adventures and that sort of thing. And there's such a small segment of the population of the world, people who can go on these adventures. And I'd like to have the other stories come out, the people who need to go fishing at the dam because it's a free way to spend the day with your family. Like, what's that adventure like? That's also an adventure. Let's hear about it. And let's hear about the difficulties inherent in being poor.
And in my case, the Chinese Exclusion Act was classist. It was targeted at excluding Chinese laborers and prostitutes. It made exceptions for merchants, diplomats, teachers, students, etc. So there is that, so a boat from China arrives in San Francisco. All the merchants in first class, if they already have been pre-cleared, they can just disembark in San Francisco without going to Angel Island. Mm. And then everyone in the second class, or what do they call it? Steerage class, go to Angel Island. So there is already that element of it. On the other hand, when you exclude a group of people based on their race, they have to prove that they belong to the upper class. Mm-hmm. So there were stories of laborers who, saved their money and, worked hard and, built their own, business, their own businesses. So they became merchants. But at Angel Island, the immigration officers inspected their hands and say, your hands are calloused. You cannot be a merchant. So class. So in the case of the Chinese Exclusion Act, class is partial. It doesn't reprieve you entirely, but obviously it gives you, some advantages that other people don't have. On the other hand, in this, in the case of the women that I write about, most of them would be wives of merchants. They would not be wives of laborers because, well, firstly, it's the merchants who can afford to bring in wives. But, it obviously, it would have influenced their lives in a bunch of different ways. A third thing is that a rich Chinese woman would not come to America during that time. Because, there are two things. One is that back then, in Chinese culture, it was actually considered unseemly for women to travel. And even men, men who come to America, a lot of times they would take a wife first, try and have a kid, then come to America. Sometimes the kid is born after he's left. And but the wife's job is to stay at home and take care of his parents. So for a woman to come to America, she's usually not. I mean, obviously, she's a merchant's wife, but she's not like the richest of the rich. And the richest of the rich were not coming to America back then. They didn't, the Chinese elite stayed in China, and they still stay in China.
Wasn't the Chinese Exclusion Act like a series of laws that were enacted, and one of them actually severely restricted the immigration of females of Chinese descent? And it was the only one that restricted by gender for a certain group.
Yes.
And so there's a severe ratio between men and female immigrants. You want to talk to that and
Sure.
what that did in terms of warping the gender relations and the class?
Yes. This is a book that's full of notes. At the back, I have what I call a history of Chinese immigration to America. So the first federal immigration law ever, with regards to anyone, is the 1875 Page Act. It prohibited the entry of contract laborers and Chinese women suspected of prostitution. And that's also part of the reason why there were so few women, Chinese women who came to America, because they had to prove that they were not prostitutes. And the way you prove that you're not a prostitute is to show up at the American consulate in Hong Kong and get interrogated about your sex life. If you had sex outside of marriage, you'll be considered a possible prostitute and not even allowed on the ship. So there were very few women who wanted to go through that process. And this law predated the Exclusion Act. The Exclusion Act was 1882. And as I said, there's also in 1924, there was the Immigration Act that excluded all aliens ineligible to citizenship, including the wives, the foreign-born wives of Chinese merchants. So that also cut the number of Chinese women who came to America.
Laura, what are you currently working on?
What am I currently working on? Thank you for asking that question. I only laugh because in my own brain lately I've been trying to sort it out. But I wrote my first play. It was produced in Fort Collins last spring, and so I'm working on getting that out to different theaters. It's about Aldo and Estella Leopold and soil science and dancing nematodes. So that was... Thank you. Some people love the idea of dancing nematodes on stage. But that was a real different project for me. And truly, I feel like my home base is fiction. And I have another novel in mind. So I'd like to get the play out and launch into a new novel. And all of my novels are loosely connected. Not one depends on the other, but characters in one show up in another. And there's a character who I've written about several times who show up as a minor character in these books, and she's somebody who's fascinating me right now, and I want to let her tell her whole story in my next novel. So that's starting to percolate and come out now. And, I'll keep on writing. Yeah.
Is the story about dancing nematodes, is that a play for kids or for adults?
It could be. There's a safe version. It's a pretty family-friendly, although I have a creation myth. It's about a futuristic society in which all our soil has been ruined. Or the soil's been ruined on planet Earth, and as we wait for it to regenerate, there's a female scientist named Estella, after Estella Leopold, who is doing testing on soil and imagining various things like nematodes dancing and that sort of thing as she heals and waits for the earth to heal. And so it was a fun way, a trope really, to get a lot of imaginative stuff in there, and I think it'd be really fun to take into the schools. And because the thing about what I was trying to do is like put science, one thing I love doing is writing about science and trying to bring story to science. And I do that, I write fiction in the mornings and nonfiction for magazines in the afternoon. And my favorite thing to do is to try to bring science to the people. Or just make it accessible. There's so much cool science out there, but it's sometimes hidden in journals that no one reads. And so what I wanted is my underlying theory was that humans, it's really hard for us to understand and love what we can't see. Like we just literally need to be able to see it to start to have empathy. I would argue. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I observe it. And so if we could see nematodes struggling for life and getting healthy and the amending soil and the healthy bacteria and fungi. If we could see that on stage, we might actually, when we go out to garden or amend our soil or plant more seeds, we might think of them dancing down there and having fun. So I wanted to put on stage what is invisible to the human eye. And that was a blast. Thanks.
We actually have about 5 minutes left. Can I ask you to read maybe a little bit more?
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay. You want to read a poem and then I'll read a short section?
Let's
Find it?
see.
Or whoever finds their passage first.
Yeah. Let's see. What else? Well, I can read a couple more poems from the beginning. In a wooden building. So I wait on Angel Island, this island of immortals. The grass is dry and golden. Waves score the headlands. And the sea turns around me. The children, now a year older, a year beyond their father, another year without me. Each day we knit in silence, socks for the children, hats for the parents, and our words swirl in the sea. A brush and a bottle of ink. I took them when he died. He loved to write. What would he say if he were me? I open the bottle, I dip in the brush, I write on the walls. I tell the story of a widow, alone in a prison at sea. I tell the story of long nights, wanting my children with me. I imagine him in heaven. I write to forget the tedium, and maybe one day you'll remember me.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you. That was beautiful. And I'll end with just a few paragraphs from the Blue Hour, and I started with a bear, and I'll end with a bear. The same bear has been gone into hibernation, and one of the different characters of the town gets to crawl in to the bear den after it's been tranquilized. The Colorado Parks and Wildlife is cutting off the GPS collar. And this is something I got to do in real life, but I fictionalized it for a character. And she speaks well to what I think everyone in the book is doing, which is try to love a little deeper, live a little truer, be a little more honest with themselves and the world. And so she's outside of a bear den, and she gets to climb in with the bears. And she's with a gentleman who says this to her. He leaned forward and whispered to her, I was thinking about this on the snowshoe up here, Win. Even married people in Paris of all places, well, you better believe they doubt and suffer. They don't know what it is they want or how best to get there, whether they've given their life enough thought, which requires time, or if they've made the right decisions, which requires courage. They know as well as we do, Win, that life keeps an account of both the decisions we don't make and those we do. Don't beat yourself up about it anymore. Look forward in your life. Go be with the bear. She nodded to him and herself. You can do this, you will do this, she thought to herself, and broke his gaze and looked in the den. She patted his gloved hand with her own and then inched towards the bear, then past the mama bear, first on hands and knees, made difficult because of her avalanche shovel, then on stomach as the cavern got smaller. It was hard to make out how the body of the yearling was positioned given the lack of light and the amount of fur, but she felt around until she knew she was touching his head. She couldn't raise her own head to get a full view. She was smashed on her stomach, but she let go of the shovel, caution be damned, and put her other arm out. And in this way, she was touching the mama bear's hind leg with her right hand, the yearling's shoulder with her left, and she lay gently digging her fingers into fur. They did not smell as bad as she thought they would, not the rank odor she'd smelled when they were near dumpsters of wild urine and rot. They smelled of pine needles and cold and something pure. She closed her eyes so she could breathe it in, feel the oily, coarse fur, and rested her face down right on the duff, the pine needles jabbing at her cheekbone. This is the best moment you are ever going to have, she told herself. Please remember it. And I won't tell you what happens there either, but yay for bears.
Thank you so much to Laura and Teow for sharing your beautiful words and your insight with us.
Thanks. And we'll be signing books out there, I think.
Yes, and they will be signing books out. The book signing table is just straight out there.
And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.